right. Welcome, everyone, to another colloquium in our neural engineering series. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Winston Chiong, who's an associate professor at UCSF. He's in the Department of Neurology, and he also runs the UCSF Decision Lab, as well as being the current director of the UCSF Bioethics Department. And his research spans sort of an interesting combination of decision-making as well as bioethics, and is informed by his unique training that's both in clinical domains as well as bioethics and cognitive neuroscience. And he studies cognitive disorders like Alzheimer's, as well as the ethical and societal implications of altered brain functions and the therapies to treat cognitive disorders. And he's a real leader in this area of neuroethics. For instance, he serves on the Brain Initiative's working group in neuroethics. And so it's a really great pleasure to have him here at the University of Washington to tell us about his latest work. So, welcome.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Amy, for the introduction and also for the invitation to come and speak with you today. It's very exciting for me. It's my first in-person talk in quite a while, and it's the first time I've been invited to give a talk at a College of Engineering, which, for reasons I'll explain in the talk, is exciting to me and also, I think, important for the field of neuroethics. So thank you so much for having me. Start with my acknowledgments. I run a lab that receives funding from NIH, as Amy said, for both work in neuroethics and also for research on the neuroscience of human decision-making, particularly in cognitive disorders of aging. As she mentioned, I'm a member of the NIH Brain Neuroethics Working Group and also of the American Academy of Neurology's Ethics, Law, and Humanities Committee. But of course, my remarks today don't reflect the views of the AAN or the NIH. One big caveat is that I'll be presenting a lot of ethnographic qualitative research with you today, and I'm not trained and I'm not a practicing ethnographic qualitative researcher, so I'm really going to be presenting to you research and data that have been collected by other people on our team and had the benefit of working with a really fantastic interdisciplinary team, Dan Dohan and Tobias Hauserman, who are sociologists, Alyssa Bernstein-Seidman, who's a medical anthropologist, and two fantastic research coordinators, Kaylin Lechner and Celeste Fong. As you may know, at UCSF, I'm surrounded by an amazing group of brilliant and generous colleagues, only some of whom I have space to list here. Want to particularly point out my colleague Liz Zhang, who's a sociologist and physician who's been trying to get me interested in human-centered design for many years. It's finally gotten me to give this talk. And most of all, of course, I want to thank the research participants whose voices I'll be sharing with you today. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about what I see as the relationship between neuroethics, bioethics, and engineering. I'll tell you a little bit about closed-loop neuromodulation for refractory epilepsy. That's people who have repeated seizures that are not controlled adequately with medication. I'm going to present for you some ethnographic research looking at really, the everyday lives of people with this disorder who have, an implanted device for managing their condition, and hope to draw some lessons that we might apply to the design of future interventions. So I think the starting point for my talk, and probably almost every talk I should give, is first, what do I even mean? Or what do we even mean by this term neuroethics? And I hope at this point you all know enough to be a little bit suspicious anytime anyone comes to you with a new term that's coined with this buzzy prefix, neuro, right? Like if we're talking about neuromarketing or neurolaw or neurosupplements or neurofeedback, neurofinance, you should be a little bit on guard that somebody is trying to sell you something probably expensive and of questionable efficacy. So, we should apply the same skepticism to the term neuroethics. And I'm sure some of you are also thinking, well, wait, the brain is a biological system, and we already have this field called bioethics, right? So what do we mean by introducing this new term, neuroethics? Why is that a thing? And I would start answering this question by first pointing to the breadth of disciplines we have currently engaged in developing these exciting, cutting-edge new interventions for intervening on the human brain. So in yellow here, we have these kind of traditional clinical brain-based disciplines There's a whole other talk I could give about why there's so many, but these are the doctors, these are the people who are seeing people with brain-based disorders. Over here in blue, we have people in these kind of traditional scientific domains that study the brain or whose expertise is necessary and who've been collaborating with the clinicians for a long time. And then here in pink, what's new in this group, from my view, is really all of you. Right? These are the people who are going to be building the tools that we need to understand and manipulate this amazingly complex physical system that we're all carrying around inside of our heads. And from an ethics perspective, one question that I'm interested in asking is, what does it mean to bring such disparate groups of scholars together? And should that shift how we think about ethics? So here's a piece of what I'm calling anecdata. This is not proper research data. This is just a quick poll we did at one of our retreats for our Center for Neural Engineering Prostheses between Berkeley and UCSF. So we had a retreat. We had about 40 people there, mostly not clinicians, right? The clinicians were all seeing patients. And it was my first presentation there, and I was saying, we're going to start an ethics program. I want to know, what are the things that you guys are really worried about? What do you want us to focus on? And we gave people a few options. I'm sorry, because of the way the figures put together, it may be difficult to read in the back. So I'll just walk through with you the options I gave people. So in blue, we said, well, one thing you might be worried about is, we're mucking around in people's brain. We might be affecting these really fundamental features of what makes who they are. And then here in green, issues of informed consent, right? Like, can people even understand what they're agreeing to when they get a device like this put in their heads? In pink, issues related to reliability, right? The safety of this thing, how are they tested? What happens if things fail? And then in magenta, these broader impacts, right? So even if you're somebody who doesn't choose to have an implanted device, what does it mean for you if you live in a society where increasingly people are going to have these devices, are going to be modified in these ways, and what does that mean for the milieu that we're all operating in? So again, didn't have a lot of responses from clinicians, but we've got neuroscientists here and engineers here. I'm curious if anyone has an intuition about whether we saw any differences in the kinds of things that people were concerned about depending on discipline. If anyone wants to yell out a guess. I guess I could just show, this I thought was kind of interesting, right? So again, this is not scientific, this is just one center, this is less than 40 people. But there was like an interesting divide here between what people identified as important. And what I would say is that the people who identified as neuroscientists were really focused on these kind of individual level issues, right? Mucking around with somebody's personality, or whether or not the individual could properly agree, could properly consent to having this intervention. Whereas the people identified as engineers tended to identify more what I would view as system issues, right? So what's the backup? What's the safety protocol here? And what does it mean for the whole system, the whole group of people? And this was very interesting to me because of my view on the history of bioethics and the influence of bioethics on clinicians and neuroscientists. So here's a paper I've written recently. If you're interested, I need to point this way. If you're interested in the broader views on the topic, but if you asked me to define what's bioethics, I would define bioethics as really a social and political movement that began in the United States in the post-World War II era and spread to other places that was really kind of prompted and inspired by these tremendous advances that we developed in our technical abilities to intervene on the human body, which were amazing, were life-saving, but also started to raise these really troubling questions for us about, whose life should be saved if we have to choose, or how do we trade off one person's medical well-being against another, right? Or, who even should be in the room when these kinds of decisions are made. It also was prompted by our awareness of, these Nazi biomedical experiments and violations of human dignity and consent in those contexts. And this has been a transformative movement in medicine and in human subjects research, right? So I'm a doctor. I would say that a prior generation of doctors had a very paternalistic ethos where we would impose interventions on people without their knowledge or consent, oftentimes for their benefit, sometimes for the benefit of other people. Sometimes we weren't very clear even about why that was, and we took that as kind of our prerogative to do. And things like that still happen now, don't get me wrong, but that's no longer part of our ethos, right? So our ethical view of ourselves and our obligations to society, to patients, to research participants, that's been transformed. However, there's a lot that bioethics has not touched. There's a lot that has not been fixed. And one thing that I think that we bioethics should be especially chastened by, I mentioned before that bioethics is kind of an American cultural export, right? Like this is sort of the birthplace of bioethics and kind of spread from here to other places. Well, if you think about it at a systems level, you know that in the developed world, we have the most dysfunctional health system of any country, right? So we've got brilliant doctors, we've got brilliant nurses, we have amazing interventions, we have terrible outcomes. And a couple examples, many of you may know that the leading cause of personal debt in the United States is medical debt, where people with insurance can still go into debt if they get sick. That's just not even a thing, right, in other similarly developed countries. That doesn't exist, and here it's the leading cause of people going into bankruptcy. And I don't have to explain to all of you how the ongoing COVID pandemic has really exposed all of the cracks in our approach to health and the ways in which, as a system, our health system is failing, particularly those who are most vulnerable. So, this is the hidden agenda in my talk today. This is why I was so excited to come when Amy invited me, because when we think about these three groups that I talked about, you know, clinicians and neuroscientists, we are trained to think about individual level phenomena. It's probably not even just a matter of how we're trained, it's probably a selection bias, right? So when I used to interview applicants to medical school, of course, they're all people who wanted to go into medicine to help people, but they wanted to help people in a particular way, right? They wanted to help people at an individual level, right? You can help people by building something, like building a bridge, developing systems for mitigating climate change, by building tools. You could help a lot more people that way, but the people who I was seeing, these bright, young pre-med students, they wanted to help people on a one-to-one basis, right? And I think neuroscientists generally tend to be people who are motivated to understand private experience and understand you know, what makes people as individuals work. So we're not really systems level thinkers. We don't have within our disciplines the intellectual resources for thinking about the sophisticated, intelligent design of systems. And my hope, and I'm not sure about this, but my hope is that you all kind of do, right? That this is a field in which these kind of design questions come up. So that's kind of the plea I'm making here in terms of what are the intellectual contributions we need from these different fields in neuroethics. And I'll say that within medicine, there's been a small but growing movement of people who are interested in borrowing design ideas. Here's a paper from our number 2 or number 3 journal, JAMA, on human-centered design and trust in medicine. But my confession to you today is that I put the term human-centered design in my title more as a challenge to myself and not as a marker of my professional expertise, right? So this is something I've been trying to learn a lot about in the last few months in particular. I'd be very happy in my meetings today to be told if I'm just really wrong about how this applies, or if there's a better idea that that exists in design and engineering and computer science fields that we can borrow from to think about these issues. I'd be very, very happy to learn more about that. So that's kind of really why I've come to talk to you today. Okay, so I'm asking you for your help. I need to tell you a little bit about the clinical context, the domain in which we're operating, so that you guys can know how to help me. Right? So we're going to talk in particular, the use case that we're going to focus on is closed-loop neuromodulation for refractory epilepsy. And again, by that I mean epilepsy, so people who have repeated seizures, and refractory in that they're not adequately controlled by medication. And I think that in some way, all of the speakers in the colloquium this term are going to be touching on ideas related to this idea of closed loop or adaptive neuromodulation. And at least in the clinical setting, what I can say about this is that we've been using this older model of open loop neuromodulation for almost 4 decades now. So this is a very old, in some ways amazingly dumb, and yet miraculously effective intervention for selected people, right, for a certain set of disorders. And this is a device where electrodes are implanted in your brain. They deliver electrical stimulation at continuous frequency and intensity. And we basically can go up and we can go down, right? So a patient with a disorder like Parkinson's disease, they go into the clinic, their clinician takes their history, sees how they're doing that day, can kind of dial it up, dial it down, depending on side effects, depending on symptoms. And then the patient walks out, goes home, again, with this stimulator, with these electrodes implanted in their head, just continuously delivering current. and then they walk around like that for weeks or months until they come back and get it adjusted again. So amazingly complex system, right, the brain, and we're delivering stimulation in this very, very simple way, but for people with Parkinson's disease, with some of these other disorders, that's remarkably effective. Of course, that's not going to work for most neuropsychiatric disorders. That's not going to work for most conditions. And so what we're all very excited about is the development of these closed-loop neuromodulation techniques, right? And so these are devices that can stimulate, but they can also kind of see what they're doing, right? They can decode, they can record what's going on in the brain, and then on board they've got some simplified algorithms integrated into the device that are able to adjust and manipulate the stimulation in response to that feedback. So that's that sort of closed-loop metaphor. So here you've got dynamic neural biomarkers that a device is responding to. You're dealing with chronic ambulatory data, which is its own thing, and opens up the possibility for much finer-grained control of brain activity. So control of brain activity, I don't need to tell you that this freaks people out. These are free text responses we have from a national population survey that we just ran, so we're still cleaning the data, doing data quality checks. This is again, not even the point of scientific data, but I just want to share with you the kinds of things that come to people's mind when we explain to them these sort of interventions, right? These are things that get people quite nervous for various reasons. But I should say that this is not science fiction, right? This is something that we are doing now, and the system I'm going to be talking to you about is this NeuroPace responsive neurostimulation, or RNS system, which we've been using now for over a decade. So about a third of patients who have epilepsy do not adequately respond to medications. Amazingly, despite decades of investment by pharmaceutical companies and by university labs and so forth, we've done all this research, we've developed all these new medications for epilepsy. This proportion has not changed in 50 years. So there's an amazing number of people out there who are still having seizures that are interfering with their life, that are interfering with their independence, that are not controlled with medication. Ideally, in that circumstance, if you have that situation, we might be able to identify a seizure focus, so we could find a part of your brain that is safely and sufficiently isolated from critical brain functions like movement, like language. If we can do that, we can take that part of the brain out and cure people's epilepsy. But as you can imagine, there are many, many patients who, for anatomical or other reasons, are not candidates for that kind of resection surgery, where we can just sort of take out the problem. And so for these patients, in 2013, RNS was approved. So this is the only closed-loop brain stimulation device in regular use. You have this sort of skull-based neurostimulator with electrodes that go into the brain. This is a depiction of sort of an electrocardiographic tracing, and in this, the device detects this epileptiform kind of abnormal activity that's sort of an indicator or warning of a seizure. It delivers mild electrical counterstimulation, interrupts the seizure, and you see sort of the return of the normal recording. So it's continuously sort of monitoring and recording brain activity. As we'll talk about later, it's got very, very limited onboard memory, so the buffer for storing these data is very, very short, unfortunately, and that means that the patient has to use the sort of wireless wand device to communicate with the stimulator every day, download the data to their personal computer, and then upload that data to a cloud service that's run by the manufacturer, where their clinician can review their recordings. So in some ways, a kind of simple system, but actually explaining it, and you can imagine that explaining this to patients, it gets pretty complicated in terms of all the different steps that you have to do to use this thing. Okay. This is an opportunity for us who, if we're interested in the development of these closed-loop neuromodulation devices, this is an opportunity to think about how does this work in the real world. We've got 3,000 people more who now are walking around with these devices in their heads every day, right? And some of them, the people who were in the early clinical trials, they've had this device for over 10 years. So this is a chance to ask people, well, how are you actually using the device? What does this look like in your life? And we all know that what something looks like in someone's life or practice can be really different from the way that a designer might draw it up. We can get into beliefs, ethical concerns, other concerns that people have about it. I kind of showed you before that in the lay public, this is something that occasions a lot of fear. What is it like, when you actually have one of these computers that's in your brain that's continuously monitoring your brain activity and changing your brain activity based upon those readings? And the big picture, of course, is not just to talk about epilepsy, but to think about, for all of you, some of you are going to be designing devices in the future. What can we learn from these experiences? What can we learn from these voices that will help us inform how we design these things in the future? We've published this paper. We've got another paper in preparation based upon this work. As I'll explain, we've done very, very intensive observation and interviewing of a small number of people who have this device. I'm going to present some material from the paper and all other material that wasn't included in this paper, wasn't part of that story, but is more relevant to the story that I want to tell today. So the framework for my talk today, as I mentioned before, is this idea of human-centered design. And the idea here is to, in some ways, think about co-designing interventions with the people who are affected. And the aim here is really to understand the human context in which these interventions are used, and what are the needs we're responding to, and also what are the drawbacks that we might introduce, right? We're trying to help, but there can be unintended consequences, and we're more likely to have unintended consequences the further away we are from where something's put into practice. And so to some extent, even though, we were not thinking about, when we set up our study as a study in human-centered design, the methods we use, the ethnographic methods, the observation, the interviewing, those are all keystones also of human-centered design, particularly in this sort of first panel of kind of understanding what's going on with people, observing, telling stories about what people are doing. And you can see the sort of loops drawn in. There's actually kind of a parallel to the diagram I showed you before, that this is supposed to be an iterative process that informs itself. And so think about this as maybe the first stage in designing the next device. In our study, we did intensive longitudinal observation. We actually started with people before they even got the implant. So we have about 12 patients and their caregivers in the study. 10 of them we actually met even before they got the device. So we got to see the early conversations they had with the neurosurgeon, with the epilepsy doctor about what to expect, what to understand, how to think about this sort of thing. So that was kind of this first time point here. And then after they got implanted with the device, before it was turned on, usually we would see them in their kind of clinic appointment. In some cases, we actually got to observe the clinic appointment at which the device was activated, which is a really kind of special time in some ways in the lives of these patients and families. And I'll share some observations from those visits. I think they're very powerful. And then we went to people's homes and we interviewed them with their caregivers, and we got to talk to them about their experiences, and we got to talk to them outside the medical setting, which is really important to us, right? So if you interview people in the clinic, if you interview people in the hospital, patients are conditioned, especially as a doctor, patients are conditioned to give me the information they think I'm looking for, and oftentimes that's for clinical management, that's for some other, that's for my goals, right? And so partly because the people we had doing the research were not doctors, they were sociologists, they were research coordinators, they didn't have that orientation, and they would go to people's homes, and I think that setting was really important to bring out. Well, I'll share with you some of the quotes that are quite revealing in terms of, what does this look like, right, in people's messy apartments and with their dogs and with all their stuff that you don't see when they come to the clinic setting. And then we interviewed them again about a year or so after their implant. So this is after they've had some time, the device has been adjusted, they've kind of learned a little bit more about how it's integrated in their lives. There were a number of things that we went looking for in the study, and that turned out to be quite different from what we found. And what I would say is that when we were designing the study, we were very focused on this limb of the loop, right? We were really focused on that, this is where we're intervening on the brain, we're changing people's brain activity. We want to know more about how changing people's brain activity with a neuromodulator is affecting people. And you can read more about that in Toby's paper, but what I would say is that a lot of things we were looking for, and a lot of things that in the neuroethics literature people have been worrying about in terms of affecting people's identity or personality or changing the way they kind of viewed themselves in a kind of fundamental basic way, those didn't really play out, at least in our research. And again, for the negative findings there, I'll refer you to Toby's paper. But I want to focus today on what we kind of unexpectedly found. And when I put it up on screen, it will seem really obvious. And I think we sometimes think to ourselves, yeah, well, duh, we should have seen that coming. But we weren't really focused on this limb of the loop. So what I would say is that for a lot of the devices we're thinking about, brain-computer interfaces, things like that, things that are not even neurostimulators, a lot of them involve recording and decoding brain data. And one, again, unexpected, but now kind of embarrassingly unexpected takeaway is how meaningful this is to people. So let me share a few quotes. So we asked a patient, what was it like when you came to clinic? So we saw them in clinic, and we came and saw them later in their home, and we said, what was it like to see your brain data when you went to go see your doctor? And this patient said, well, it was pretty shocking, but interesting at the same time, because I'm like, oh, that's my brain. I never knew it's just amazing to see the activity, like how the spikes go from this to a lot more. People are inherently interested in their brain data. It's fascinating to them. Just seeing the data, even if they don't understand the data, they start to put together mental models. Those mental models may not be very informed by the science. They may be based on many, many other things, but there's just something that's inherently interesting to people about this. And of course, these are people who are seen in the context of a chronic and debilitating illness, right? So for somebody who's refractory epilepsy, this has been a part of their life for years, maybe their whole adult life, maybe going back to childhood. And so their brain data is something that has to get incorporated into a whole long, kind of painful narrative for them. And that has even more significance. So this is a different patient talking about this feeling of seeing this brain data as part of a puzzle that's being slowly put together. That's just how I kind of see it, because this has been a slow and long process, like literally putting a puzzle together. So these people, they're desperate to figure out what's going on with them. They're desperate to make sense of their experience of their illness. And having this kind of device becomes a really, really crucial part of kind of their understanding of this important part of who they are. I'm going to share with you an observation note. So as I said before, we got to see a lot of patients and their families the first time that the device was turned on, or the first time that the device started recording. So here's a long, I'm just going to show you some selected pieces, but kind of a long observation note from our ethnographer. So the clinician pulls up the RNS recording data, and all the family huddles around the computer screen. This is the first time they are seeing device recordings. The patient's mother pulls out her phone to take photos, explaining that the patient's aunt is going to ask for pictures. The clinician shows data from a Monday at 10 a.m. and points out the increase in wave height on the left hippocampal leads, explaining that this is a seizure. The mother is shocked by the timestamp, saying, he was awake. The clinician says it looks like the patient's seizure activity is highest in the early morning hours, around 2 a.m. The mother said the patient is asleep during that time, and she suspects that this has been going on since childhood. The patient said, I'll be damned, that's crazy. So this is a collective experience, right? This is families having, they're kind of gathered around. This is something that they're all experiencing together. And they're coming to different realizations. Like as they are seeing the data, they are reformulating their own experience of what the patient's illness is, the manifestations of the patient's illness, and kind of what's going on. So this is something that's very meaningful, and again, it's happening kind of right in front of us as we see them in the clinical setting. I mentioned before some patients had really positive responses to seeing their brain data, but this wasn't actually universal. So the patient that we observed in clinic, in the previous slide, so this is the whole quote. I love this whole quote, actually. We interviewed him later on at home, and we said, what was that like for you? And again, a lot of the patients said, I loved seeing the data. I was really fascinated. This patient got nauseous seeing his data, right? And so this is a different reaction. And when I read this, like he's talking about, heartbeat, that's one thing. I could see it tracing in my heart, but like brain waves, that's gross, right? And for me, when I read this quote, I think about one of those illusions where like it kind of feels like you're falling into the image, like it goes on forever, right? So you can envision this patient, and he's watching his own brain, right, as it's watching his own brain, as it's watching his own brain. You sort of felt like it's just going in forever. Again, so not everyone had positive reactions to seeing this, but it's meaningful for everyone. Okay. One thing is that the device offers a kind of testimony, right? The device can tell us whether there's seizure activity occurring at a certain time. And so sometimes the device corroborates a patient's experience of illness, but in other times the device can contradict the patient's impression of what's going on with them. So here's a patient for whom that was very confirmatory, being able to look at that screen and figure out, that there was legitimately something going on, which we had kind of seen before in the EEGs, but this one was so specific, and he was able to explain what these different graphs, and I felt very reassured in terms of, not only what I had been doing, but what he had been doing. So, excuse me, this is a case where the device kind of helps to confirm what the patient's own experience has been. Now, sometimes this was not the case. I have to tell you first that one thing about epilepsy is that people who have epilepsy have these kind of transient, vague, fleeting sensations. And I'll rephrase and say that people have transient, vague, fleeting sensations, right? And all of you have kind of learned to just sort of ignore them. But if you had epilepsy, those transient, vague, fleeting sensations that are going on all the time, some of those might be harbingers and indicators of loss of control, of disability, of social embarrassment, of not being able to do things, not being able to work, not being able to drive. You start really having to pay a lot of attention, and you're trained by your clinicians to start paying a lot of attention to these weird, funny feelings. But how can you know if this transient, vague, fleeting, funny feeling is one of the ones that just everybody has, or if it's the sign of a seizure? Well, if you have one of these devices that's continuously monitoring and recording your brain activity, you could mark a period of time, right? So I'm having a funny feeling. I can tell my device, hey, store this for later, send it to my epileptologist, and we'll take a look at it, right? And then you can view that section of time, that epoch, and look for confirmation that this transient funny feeling you're having is actually the thing that you need to be watching out for. The way this actually happens is a little clumsy. I have another quote that gets into this, but the patient has a magnet that they're supposed to pass over the stimulator site on their skull, right? And so that communicates with the device and says that this is a record, right? So the device has algorithms on board that automatically record and store events that it identifies as seizures, and then in addition, you can tell the device, I want you to store this moment in time, and I want to look at it later. And again, sometimes those moments in time, you go to the clinic, you review them with your doctor, and they say, yes, that's actually a seizure aura. That is the warning we want you to be looking out for. Other times you go to your doctor, and you don't see anything there, right? And what does that mean, particularly if this is the thing that you have been using as part of your practice to tell you when you're safe, if you've been using that as part of telling you, when you're in a dangerous situation. So here's one patient response. So I was surprised. So we interviewed the patient and caregiver after a clinic visit in which they didn't see any seizure activity on these mark tracings. So I was surprised because I just wanted to see if I wasn't sure if I was using it right, or I was still very new to using the magnet. It was my first time using it, so I figured I was having my aura, so I figured I'd just swipe and see if they were able to catch it. And the caregiver says, is she being overly sensitive and is she crying wolf is the wrong phrase, but more, is she trying to be so diligent at capturing stuff that any little thing she feels, she captures it? So this is like a bit decentering for both the patient and the caregiver, right? And this thing that she's trying to be a good patient, she's trying to do the things, she's trying to identify the events that she has been asked by her clinicians to regard as significant and respond to. This is a part of her practice of care for herself, and now it looks like maybe she's been focused on the wrong thing this whole time. Here's another quote I really like about kind of the difficulty that we might have in integrating the information we get into our practice. So again, there's people talk about seizure auras and then clinical seizures. So seizure auras can often be like an internal sensation, like a rising feeling in your stomach or a funny smell or things like that. Actually, from a electroencephalographic point of view, they're kind of seizures. They are seizures, right? That's the beginning of the seizure. But we tend to distinguish clinically between auras and kind of full-blown seizures. So this patient says, I used to think I could really tell the difference between an aura and a seizure, especially if I didn't have a blank out or anything. I have auras a lot, and I don't write them down, whereas I've written down every seizure I've had, I think, for 6 years. I think maybe, and they call auras a seizure, even though I feel like I can tell the difference. Now I'm thinking that it can be an aura, and this device will record it as a seizure. So probably I should write down every aura, but I just have them a lot. So practical problem here, right? So this patient has a practice of care. This is part of her care for herself, where she writes down every seizure she has. And people have told her before that auras are seizures, but that didn't make sense to her before. Now she's starting to think auras are seizures, but how's she going to integrate this in her practice? She has too many auras to write all of her auras down, but it turns out that they're really the same event. So this is like a shift we're seeing in this patient from kind of like a clinical conception of her disease to like an electrical conception of her disease, right? It's like she's thinking about her disease now, where she's kind of moving towards thinking about her disease in terms of physiology, as opposed to thinking about her disease in terms of like the manifestations she experiences. So that's just kind of a different way of even thinking about what's going on in her head. This is a quote from the same patient, just saying that I mentioned before, we're dealing with remarkable amounts of data, right? We have continuous, real-time neural data that you're collecting from people. And I've already told you that the data are really important to people. And so what does it mean to them that you all of a sudden have this stream of information about the most kind of intimate part of themselves, right? That's coming to this device all the time. So we asked, what is it like in terms of, you upload all this data, right? That's the other thing, that the patients are doing all this work. Every day, they're putting this wand to their head, they're communicating with their device, they're uploading the device to this server. They don't get to see the data until they go to the doctor, right? So they're doing all this data collection work for us, and yet it's a whole mystery to them until they get to go see it. So we're asking, okay, well, in between, how are you feeling? God, I couldn't stand to wait. I don't even know when my next appointment is. It's going to be a couple months maybe. Oh God, I couldn't stand to wait till then. To me, it's really important to know when I have them. That's why I've always written them down for 6 years. I wouldn't understand how anybody would not want to know for sure whether they had one or not. So, and I don't know, I mean, this is probably to some extent universal for people with epilepsy, but when you have a device in your head that can give you the answer, right, then wanting that information just becomes that much more kind of tangible. Here's one about what does this mean for the clinicians, right? We've got these epilepsy doctors. Before, they were just looking at people's seizure diaries, and they're trying to interpret what was going on with people when they would come in clinic, but then the patients would go home, and then unless the patient had like an emergency event, the doctor didn't really have to worry about, they would wonder what was going on with the patient, but there wasn't any more information. Now there's a source of data that's being uploaded every day. What does that mean for the poor doctor if you think about it? Here's a caregiver talking about one event where a seizure was detected remotely. That was probably my changing moment, because I'm like, oh, wait a second. This device picked up everything, and it showed the doctors exactly what happened. So you think, gosh, he's here, right? The patient's here, they're over there, but that device could be downloaded every day, and the epileptologist can look at it. And I assume that if a seizure happened, obviously we would know it, but I assume I would probably get some kind of phone call. So think about the workflow of a very limited set of clinicians we have who are experts in treating epilepsy at all, and then trying to train some of them to use this device. We're going to have to really kind of change the way that they practice, because now that we have this wire in people's heads that could tell us, at any time, and again, think about how much labor the patients are putting into the data collection, right? They're uploading their data every day. Maybe not unreasonable for them to think that somebody is on the other end looking at their data every day, but if you're an epileptologist and you've got 50 patients, how are you going to manage all that information, right? And I have another paper with two epileptologist colleagues where one of them says that, real-time recording of data is not the same as real-time interpretation of data, and we have to figure out how to do that because, the process of generating the data, and especially the labor involved in the patients and getting the data to us, is going to generate expectations about what we do with it. So, of course, as I said before, right now, the clinicians can view the data records on this cloud server. The patients and caregivers don't themselves have access to this. So we asked people, would you want it? Right? We talked about how significant this is. What if you could look at it yourself? The patient says, oh, it'd be nice to have it at home. Even if I can't see it, if the caregiver, can see it, I think that would help explain how I did that day, or why somebody's angry at me, or somebody is, super happy with what's going on at home. Their caregiver said, I mean, it would be kind of nice to see the data. Like on days that she's like really tired, maybe she has seizures that we're not seeing. So that part would be kind of nice to see. Like, okay, on the days that she wants to sleep more, her activity level is really low. Is it because it's a really active day for her in terms of her seizures? But I guess the flip side is if you get too much data, you could be, hyper-focusing on it too much. And that would be equally not as, equally bad. So this is a good example of like kind of the flip side here and ways in which people think that, this might increase the anxiety that people have about their seizures. Here's another quote that I really like. I kind of don't think so. I mean, I do and I don't, because it'd be nice to have the warning, but at the same time, I don't want to be stifled into what I can do and what I can't. I think this piece about epilepsy makes me think of a moral dilemma that we're all facing right now with COVID. Right? So those of us who are vaccinated, apparently we can be infected and we can infect other people even if we have minimal symptoms, right? So one thing that we could all choose to do if we wanted is we could just continuously be testing ourselves, right? And then if we were positive, then we would quarantine and not see anybody and have all our food by delivery. But it'd be kind of a bummer, right? And to some extent, it's like selfishly better for us not to have the information, because if you have the information, you need to change your behavior accordingly. Right? So epilepsy is a little like that too, right? You might feel fine, but maybe you've got a lot of subclinical seizure activity, right? So if you have that data, maybe that means that you can't go for a swim. Maybe that means that you can't babysit. Maybe that means that you can't drive, but you feel fine. But if you don't have the data, then you don't have to change your behavior, right? So just like all of us with COVID tests, we may not want a continuous stream of data that has consequences for what we can do, that has consequences for our sense of freedom. And selfishly, at least, it can be better for us not to have information. Again, if we're feeling fine, to not have information that would require us to act in a different way. Here's a caregiver saying this information would be much more helpful to the patients if it was live, so that her sitting at home, she's reading, she says, I feel a little dizzy. Well, is that dizziness from the seizure? If you're live and you look right on your screen, oh yeah, if we had the readout ourselves. And one last thing I would say is that, again, the data themselves are just endlessly fascinating to people. And again, it's the thing about people that we love to have information about ourselves, regardless of whether we understand it, right? There's all kinds of biometric data that people are interested in collecting. There's all kinds of stuff that we're not sure what it means. Think about like mood rings. Think about horoscopes. Think about how far people will go in terms of projecting signals from star charts or things like that. That, there's no real mechanistic reason, sorry, for those of you who are really interested in astrology, but, there's no real reason to think that that's connected, but people can find patterns for sure, and people are motivated to find those patterns. And if that's true for something that's as far as the position of the constellations, well, again, think about a device that's directly plugged into your head. I mentioned before that there's a fair amount of work that goes into collecting the data, and that's something to think about from the perspective of usability, from the perspective of thinking about how these devices get integrated into people's lives. I mentioned before that the device has algorithms for the automated detection of events. So the device gets a set of rules, and it's tuned for an individual patient based upon their seizure location and where the electrodes are. So it's actually a very painstaking process clinically to figure out what rules to give the device. And even so, we don't always capture the events that people want us to capture. And so this is why people have to go in and mark the record as well. So here's a case where the patient comes in and says, in my seizure diary, I had this thing happen, so we're going to look at that together. So here's an observation again from clinic. Looking for the event described by the patient, the epileptologist explains that there was no recording at that time. He cautions, however, that this does not necessarily mean that no seizure had occurred. The device does not have the memory capacity for continuous recordings. We mentioned this before. The buffer on the device is kind of short. So a seizure might have been detected, but lasted less than 30 seconds and would therefore not be recorded given the instructions given to the device. That's where the magnet comes in, and the patient has a minute to grab the magnet and store the recording. Those magnet recordings are very precious for the epileptologist and his team, like gold. They discuss how to make it easier to use the magnet. They could increase the lead time for the magnet to retroactively record the incidents from 1 minute to 2 minutes, which gives the patient more time to swipe the magnet after an episode. The downside is that the device will not be able to record as many episodes. So there's some limitations here that are based on, again, this device is now over 15 years old. Newer devices will have much more capacity, but just a way in which, the kind of engineering and other design constraints of the device. Again, it's got to be like implanted in people's skull. There's a lot of limitations in terms of kind of what we can do, but this leads to clinical dilemmas in terms of what are we going to do with this particular patient so that we can capture these events that we really need to see. Okay. A few quotes from patients about this kind of fussy system that they've got to learn. This patient says, it comes with a magnet, and actually I can see it on my refrigerator. I think I didn't read the materials. I didn't even know what it was for, but one of my sisters explained that if I feel like I'm having one, I put the device on my skull, and then the same place I put the wand that downloads the data, and then that way, when I download the data with the wand to the laptop, it for sure gets that time period. So that's a pretty good description, actually, of why they use the magnet, but this is something that it took the patient's sister explaining for the patient to figure out, because it's not very intuitive. Here's kind of a funny one. This is a patient and caregiver being interviewed together, and the patient says, I'm kind of surprised at how long it takes me with the wand to get it in the right place, which you would think, after doing it for a month and a half, that you would kind of be able to just put it there and be in the right spot, but I feel like I still am kind of having to move around to make sure that it's getting it. But otherwise, it's super easy. The caregiver contradicts the patient. It's not super easy. Caregiver says, no, she's having one problem. It's what to do with the magnet. So when she's in the house, she's putting it in this little cup, and then if she's up during the day, she's putting it in one place because she was setting it around in different places. Yesterday, she was walking by the car. She had it in her pocket, and it went to the car and got stuck on the car. It got stuck on something else the other day, on the dishwasher. So this is really funny, right? So first, remember, they're supposed to use the magnet when they're having a clinical event. They're having a seizure. Their brain's not working properly, but they still have to have the presence of mind when they're having the seizure to go find this bulky device and stick it over their head. So that's, that's sort of a design constraint right there, just in terms of, we have an episodic illness and people are not neurologically normal when they're having this thing, and yet we still have to figure out how do we get the data from the device. And then, and of course, this is an episodic illness, and you don't know when your seizures are going to happen. So you have this bulky magnet. Where do you put it, right? So inevitably, you have a seizure upstairs. Of course, the magnet's going to be downstairs, right? If you have a seizure in the garage, of course, the magnet's going to be in the bathroom. And then so you carry the magnet with you. Now you've got a magnet, and the patient's walking through a garage, and this bulky magnet connects her to the car. So I mean, it's a silly quote. I think it's kind of funny, but again, just an illustration of the challenges of integrating this kind of technology. If you think about, okay, what does it really take to get these clinical events that we're really interested in and have the patient be able to, in a relatively low-tech way, communicate with the device that we want to record this for later? It's going to be a magnet, or it's going to be something else, a button, I don't know, but there's going to be something that the patient has to do to interact with the device that's going to be challenging, again, because the patient is not neurologically normal when these events occur. Okay. Oh yeah, on the dishwasher. So I want to zoom out and think not just about epilepsy, but about the human-centered design of these neuromodulatory devices. So again, I'll go back to this question of what might we not have thought about on our own, right? If we were sitting down and thinking, we really want to help people with epilepsy, we know that it's an electrical disease. We can intervene with electrical stimulation. all you need is a device that will record and capture the data, figure out what's a seizure, deliver counter-stimulation, then we would probably, at least, okay, I'll just say for ourselves, we were focused on this end, right? Oh, are we over time? Oh, sorry, I think I was going for an hour. Okay. Well, this is probably the main point, I think, which is just that we were thinking about this as being the business end of the device. And like in BCI, you might also be thinking about the effector as the business end of the device. And so just, I guess, one point that we have learned from this is just that this end of the device is really, really important, in part just because of how meaningful recording brain activity is. And so again, it sounds really obvious when I state it like that, but it is something that really kind of comes out from these stories that at least wasn't obviously evident to us when we started, before we talked to them. And yeah, I can stop there. Yeah, I think
we've got a little more time than we can, because people normally stay around for questions.
Okay. All right. I mean, I think one question: you're collecting all these data. What are you going to do with the data? Right? People want the data. They expect follow-up. They're going to reinterpret their experience in light of that data. The data are meaningful in lots of different ways. So that's like its own responsibility. Just even having the data, having access to the data, and figuring out what are you going to do with it? How are you going to provide access to people for it? Again, we talked about what are the expectations we build in for how the patient or user is going to interact with the device, especially if you're dealing with a medical and neurological population, and you're dealing with people particularly when they're maybe most vulnerable. Think a little bit about what else does it need, right? If we're trying to treat the people who are most in need. I'll mention, by the way, that people with epilepsy are among the most disadvantaged people in society. The median household income of people with epilepsy is, I believe, just at poverty level, and there's I like to say there's a bidirectional relationship between socioeconomic disadvantage and having a brain disease, right? So the people who are most likely to get a brain disease are people who are already disadvantaged from risk factors. And then if you're not already disadvantaged socioeconomically, having a brain disease, again, in an individualistic capitalistic society, those are not the traits that are valued. So if you're not already disadvantaged, you very quickly become disadvantaged. And of course, if you're already disadvantaged, you're even worse off. So if you think about here's a device, you need a home computer, you need access to the internet. What if someone's homeless? What if somebody is in a situation where their housing is very unstable, things like that. So just thinking about kind of access and implementation for these things, particularly given the needs and the stigma associated with these groups. And then just zooming out, maybe this can be a point of discussion. These are things I'm hoping to learn from you in my visit today, right? Is people who think about the design of systems, people who think about building these kinds of things, how do we think about responsible innovation? How do we think about incorporating these kinds of voices into the things that we build for the benefit of other people? And then how can we all work together, including clinicians, including scientists, including engineers, device manufacturers. So this is a really exciting time in the development of these technologies, and feel very privileged to be able, as a doctor and neuroscientist, to come and talk to you about how do we make the next generation, the next group of these things for people. So thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, do folks have questions?
Yeah, so obviously what we expect to happen if the other end of the data is not the clinician, but the computer, AI?
Yeah.
That there's going to be a Pandora's box for conspiracy theory of investor for neuroethics?
Yeah, I mean, I think to some extent, we kind of probably need for that to happen. Just, I talked a little bit about the workforce challenges. So having devices where you have a real-time continuous stream of data. I mean, to some extent, this is a perfect problem for an AI, right? You've got, and again, if you have a device that can stream wirelessly or that can store long epochs, right? One of the problems with the data we get from this device is very sparse, just because the device is getting a continuous stream of data, but it can only store a certain amount on board. That's a relatively easy, I think, technical problem to fix, I'm assuming. So, the next group of devices that are coming out, those, certainly can store data for 24 hours and things like that. Then the problem you have is that you have this endless stream of months, years, like decades of data. So to some extent, that's, well, our epileptologists are used to reading data an hour at a time, right? That's the context in which they're used to looking at data. And so to some extent, this is a perfect problem for an AI, right? Because we have too much data for a human being to look at. Well, AIs love data, right? So they're sort of differently situated than the human readers. But yeah, of course, that raises a different set of problems. Among other things, how are you going to supervise what this thing is doing, particularly if it's kind of exceeding the capacity, and also if you have such a limited set of people who are able, who have the technical skills to read the data. So to some extent, it seems very obvious that that's a direction that this has to go. And then, of course, there's a whole set of other problems related to, to AI ethics, related to algorithms. I do have a paper out on that topic also. I guess I'll pitch about, thinking about, and epilepsy might be the perfect case, right? This is a perfect use case for AI and data, because you have these kind of discrete, like dichotomous, rare events, and we have potentially now lots and lots of data to put them in. So classification can be relatively straightforward if we want to train, but then there are some problems in terms of how do we ensure that we're getting the outcomes that we're really designing for.
Fascinating talk. So I wanted to smash together the example you had of the family gathering around looking at the data, and then your example of COVID and whether it's sort of good to disclose your current state. So do you think at all about privacy? So what if this family is like, wait, you were driving when that seizure happened? Oh, you were driving my children, right? I mean, I could see this just, like, is there a way to show the initial user first? And then
Yeah. Well, so there's another partner in this, which is that, in the state of California, I think here also, clinicians are obligated to report, people with uncontrolled seizures. So this kind of directly affects people's, legal privileges in society, and consequently, their ability to live independently, their ability to work. So I'm going to answer a related question, then try to come back to your question. Think about the relative disadvantage of somebody with this device as opposed to somebody who doesn't have this device. So if you don't have a device, you come in and you report to your doctor, I had this seizure, I didn't have the seizure. It turns out that people have seizures all the time that they don't know about for different reasons. Some of them are subclinical. I mentioned before that seizures interfere with your brain activity, so there's an inherent challenge in getting people's kind of subjective memory reports of whether they had a seizure or not. So we know from devices like these, and we know from other kind of relatively objective wearable and other data, that patient seizure histories are very unreliable, and of course we should not expect them to be reliable when we know that people have an episodic brain illness that interferes with memory. But so the patient with an RNS has a continuous objective, potentially, a record of all these things. So they're going to have a lot more events detected than a patient that doesn't have this device. And it raises some questions for clinicians about, what are they obligated to report? Are patients being disadvantaged by having this device? And, some of the events that the device records would not have clinically been recorded as a seizure. There might not have been a clinical manifestation. So, it puts the neurologist in a legal bind in terms of, is this something I am obligated by the letter of the law to report? So that I think, there's a lot of biases that are built into the public health reporting for these things. In terms of privacy, I think most of the time I would say that these patients tend to be coming in with one caregiver or a few. And because epilepsy is so disabling, especially refractory epilepsy, that can vary. But a lot of people are relatively dependent on the caregiver who's accompanying them, and so they tend to rely a lot more on the caregiver in that way. And to some extent, epilepsy is associated with other cognitive problems, including problems with memory. And so to some extent, they're often relying on the caregiver to help remember what happened in the conversation, to help guide the conversation, and so forth. So those kinds of intrafamilial conflict are certainly possible, but I think they come up in practice a little less often than we might think. There's certainly other privacy concerns, of course, about who else might have access to the data and, again, what it means in this legal or regulatory context.